from Dr. Chris Preston, and the reason I thought Chris would be great to have here today is not only because of his many years of experience in research, especially around herbicide resistance, but also his really deep understanding of pre-emergent herbicides. If you haven't been on the Weed Smart website, there are a whole bunch of free courses, and this is where I first saw Chris's work and thought, you know what, he'd be really great to have down here. There's pre-emergent basics, there's how to incorporate big sixes, a whole bunch of great courses for free on the Weed Smart website. So there's lots of resources there that we could be using. And that's why I thought I'd bring Chris here today. And make sure you have lots of hard questions for him. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, thanks very much for having me across. And whilst I spend the vast majority of my time working in the grains industry, I've actually had some experience with some other industries where they've had big herbicide resistance problems. So viticulture is one, but also the clover seed growers. You think you've got a problem. The clover seed growers have a real issue about how they manage their weeds for some of the same reasons that vegetables coming into this space. One of the things that I want to say up front was that, you know, we in the grains industry, we've been dealing with this for over 30 years now. So we've learnt a lot about how do you think about this problem. And one of the things we've learnt is that you don't actually fix herbicide-resistant weeds in any one crop that you're doing. It becomes really expensive to try and do that. So growers in the grains industry have crops in their rotation where they can do better weed control on ryegrass so that then they can grow their more profitable crops. So it's a whole of rotation and it's a multi-year approach. And that quote that from the start about the work that we were doing with the grain growers in southwest Victoria and in Tasmania was really based on a long-term rotation trial that we ran for 9 years, where we learnt what not to do in that environment, and that's grow a lot of cereals, and we learnt what to do, and we developed a thing that we called the double break. So I remember having a conversation with John Midwood, and he was saying, ryegrass is getting out of control at our trial, we've got to fix it. And I said, well, we need another crop. We can't just keep growing wheat, barley and canola. And he goes, well, what do you think? And I said, all right, let's try faba beans. And John goes, oh, well, we're not going to grow failure beans. We're not going to grow them. But we grew them, and we followed that up with canola, and we were able to actually drive the ryegrass seed bank down so low in that trial that we got a few years where we didn't have to work so hard. So some of it's about how you think about your rotation. Now, I'm happy to talk about pre-emergent herbicides if you really want me to talk about pre-emergent herbicides, but that conversation you had has opened up a whole bunch of other issues, which I'm also happy to take on and talk about how my experience in a range of different crops would suggest potential ways you could think about some of those problems. So do we want to do that instead? And I can talk about pre-emergent herbicides a bit later. Yep. Yes, excellent. Okay, so what's the big, anybody got a big burning issue that they want to ask right up front if that's what you're going to talk about? Somebody want to get started? It's really easy.
What did you do in the faba beans?
So what did we do? So in that trial I was talking about, our attitude in faba beans was to go, all right, what we were going to do was we were going to have a really effective pre-emergent herbicide strategy, and that involved putting 2 pre-emergent herbicides out. We followed that up with clethodim plus butroxadim in crop. So we didn't just go with a clethodim only, we added the butroxadim to it, because one of the things we understood as some of that testing showed, that you can have quite high levels of clethodim resistance, but sometimes butroxadim added in still works. You don't use it on its own because it's not terribly effective on larger ryegrass, but as a mixture it tends to work. And then we came back and we used a practice called crop topping that we can use. It's a bit challenging in faba beans, and we ended up actually spraying between the rows rather than over the top of the crop because our faba beans were too tall. But so a late season herbicide application to stop seed set. So they were the practices that we introduced into that. And then we followed that up with canola, and we grew a Roundup Ready plus, in those days it was triazine tolerant canola. The idea being that we had a new, different residual herbicide we could use. So we had pre-emergent herbicides. We went in crop with the 2 applications of glyphosate that were allowed. We put atrazine in with one of those applications. We followed up with clethodim because we can't use butroxadim, and we crop topped. So, a lot of work there. I think that's one of the things that farmers in the grains industry realise, that for some of these crops you've got to do a lot of work to make it work. But 2 years of that, we drove the numbers right down to really low levels. We grew wheat, hardly any ryegrass in the wheat. But if we didn't keep on top of it, high rainfall areas, any ryegrass escapes produce lots of seed. If we didn't keep on top of it, within 3 years it was back up again. But using the best of our tools in our cereals, we were able to actually keep that low. So we ended up with a really successful, this is how you do it, and this is how it works. But it's about thinking about your crop rotation differently to what you're currently doing, because you know that your current crop rotation is not really working. Because otherwise you wouldn't have problems with ryegrass. So you need to be thinking about, what are the opportunities I have to do weed control in every crop in my rotation? And that might mean that there are times when you can't grow the crop you want to grow. And that's been one of the choices that grain growers have had to make. I know it sounds really difficult, but once you get the numbers down, you can grow any crop you want. So it's about driving the numbers down so you can put those crops in.
So that's my question, Chris. There is hope. So if you do the right thing, you can actually...
Look,
the problem won't go away completely, but you can get to a manageable thing.
I mean, there is hope. I've been working on herbicide resistance for over 30 years, and frankly, herbicide resistance has only got worse in all of that time. But what has happened is farmers are managing ryegrass a whole lot better than they used to. And so when we go out and do those weed surveys that that you talked about, and we get out into farmers' paddocks, these days, it's a little bit of a struggle to find ryegrass in some areas because they're managing it so effectively. And one farmer I know often says to me, he goes, "Oh, Chris," he says, "look, I got resistant ryegrass all over my farm. But when I go out to his farm, he doesn't have a lot of ryegrass. It's all resistant, but he doesn't have much." So that's the solution, is how do you get to a point, not that I don't have resistance, but how do I get to a point where I don't have a lot of ryegrass? Because if you're going to use herbicides, you're going to get resistance. Now, we can delay some of that, but we can't stop it from happening. It's inevitable. Every single herbicide we've got, we're going to get resistance to. It's a case of how do we use them to a point where we run our weed numbers down so low that it doesn't matter anymore. And so that's the approach that I've taken in the grains industry, is how do we get numbers down so that it doesn't matter that we've got resistance. So we test these, when the samples we test, we've got populations, we're testing, I think 11 modes of action now, and we've got populations resistant to 10 of them on farm. But not a lot of ryegrass, so it doesn't matter. And some of that's using your herbicides wisely, using your other tactics when you can. So one of the ones that we've really been able to bring in a lot of our areas is better crop competition. Now, we started looking at this back in the 90s, and we all wanted to have higher seeding rates and all that sort of stuff to get crop competition, but no farmer really wanted to go as far as we wanted them to go. And so we ended up with a bit of didn't really get there. They don't want to reduce their row spacings because it makes it difficult to get your crop in and out. So we discovered a few little tricks. Sowing wheat early while the ground's still warm. So a lot of wheat in South Australia this year, because it didn't rain, went in dry. Last year, same story. Growers know They need to sow it early to get that crop competition. So they're using that as one of their tools to help. And then we have our end-of-season tactics, and I think that's a real challenge that you guys have got in vegetables, that you don't really have those end-of-season tools. And the question is, well, what might those tools look like and where might they come from? So we've developed two in the grains industry over the years. One's being a thing called crop topping that I talked about in our trial work, and the other one's been harvest weed seed control, where we're trying to collect ryegrass during the harvest operation and stop it going back into the field. So we developed those two tools at the end of the season. And I think one of the challenges that I have with the clover seed growers is they're not ever going to get an end of season tool as such. So what other options do they have? And I think that from your perspective, you need to think, can we find something that we can do late in the growing season that won't damage our crop, but will stop that ryegrass seed going back down? And it might be, I was having a conversation with someone earlier, it might be that in your industry, this is where robots might come in. So if you've got a robot that does something like electrocuting weeds or lasering them or something else, that might actually fix your end-of-season problem.
So carbon, sorry, I just want to add that carbon robotics has recently been introduced into the country. It's the generation 1 is probably too large and too heavy for the Tasmanian terrain. There are about 5 or 6 machines in the country now, not being used in onions, but a lot of it is being used in leafy greens. Actually, no, you've been used in onions in South Australia as well.
Yeah.
But in Tasmania, I think it's too big a machine.
Yeah.
But there are generations coming through that are smaller and lighter.
So what I'm thinking about in terms of, that robotic space is that the vast majority of people who are operating in the robotic space are thinking about, how do I get a robot that replaces a farmer? And I think that's the wrong thing to be thinking about. What I want for weed control is, how do we get a robot that can do something a farmer can't do? So somebody mentioned we can't go out and hand pull all the ryegrass at the end of the season. Well, what happens if you didn't have to do it, but a robot could do it for you? So I'm thinking that we're going to end up wanting to have smaller robots than those to be able to do those tasks. And they're not there to replace what the farmer's doing, but they're there to do things the farmer can't do. But that's a long-term thing. But if we don't start thinking about how we're going to do it, what's going to happen is we're going to get the things that the manufacturers of robots give to us. But if we think about what we want, we've got the opportunity to influence them about the things that they might give us. I was on this. I was at a GRDC run meeting maybe a decade ago with all the people doing robotics, and everyone had a robot that could spray weeds. And this is what we're going to do. And I went, actually, Australian farmers are really, really good at spraying weeds. I mean, we heard that from you guys. They're really good at spraying weeds. Why do we need a robot to do that? Can't we have a robot that does something else? So that's where I think we need to be thinking around. Don't wait for what these manufacturers are going to give to us. Get started in talking to them about what we really need. I know you're only a small industry, but you've only got to get one person on site, one person in that sector, looking at it and going, oh yeah, this would be a really valuable thing, because then they'll look at it. It won't be just for onions and carrots and other vegetables. They might look at the same thing and say, hey, we can use these in broadacre crops as well, or we can use it in some other sector. So that end of season problem is one that I don't have a solution at the moment, and it's going to be a future solution. It's not going to be anything that we're doing currently. So it's not anything you can take from the grains industry and say, we can do that, because it just doesn't work in vegetable production.
Having said that, grains grow in a vegetable rotation.
Yes, so you can do these things in the grain side of it. So one of the things that, as I say, we've been doing is building our rotations so that we drive numbers down so we can grow those crops where we don't quite have the tools. And so we developed this double break practice that I talked about. and then demonstrated that to the growers in around Narracourt in South Australia, and they all went onto it. And then COVID intervened and we all stayed home. And got back out the back end of COVID, and I'm talking to the agros down there, and one of the agros says to me, he goes, oh, yeah, our ryegrass has got so resistant to clethodim and butoxetim now, we can't use that anymore. It's not as effective as it was. But in between, we developed an entirely new strategy, and it was actually a double pre-emergent strategy. So, and we got a new product which really helped. So we used a herbicide called Overwatch, which if you get it wrong turns your crop white, so it mightn't be for onion production. We'd use that up front, and then we come back about 3 weeks later and put out another product called Matino Complete, which contains that Sakura in it. And in that area, that would give us about 5 months control of ryegrass, that pairing. And the agronomist said to me, we're using that in wheat to fix ryegrass in wheat so we can grow our break crops. So sometimes you've got to think about it the other way around. So it's a case, I think, of identifying the crops where you've got more tools and having them in your rotation so that you can actually fix the problem and come back and be able to grow the crop that you want. Okay, so that's rotations. Other big issues you might want me to talk about.
Sounds like there's a heavy reliance on clethodim. Have you seen any difference in the efficacy of different formulations of clethodim or adding wetters, surfactant or stickers?
Okay, so clethodim, the way to get clethodim to work best is that you use a quality product and you add an oil. An oil with a wetter. So you're going to use something like Hasten. Okay, there are other versions, but you don't use just a straight oil, you have an oil with a wetter. And that's the best way to get clethodim to work. You put it on as early as you can if you really want to get it to work, because whilst it can kill tilled ryegrass, it's much better on young ryegrass. And once your ryegrass has become resistant, it's not going to kill the tilled ones. It'll shorten them up, but because you don't have any crop competition, that doesn't help. So you want to try and get that on early. And this is where, our strategy of adding the butoxetim really helps, because that's a product that only works on smaller ryegrass. So if you're going early and putting that mixture out, we can kill clethodim resistant ryegrass most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. There are some differences. One of the things about formulations of products to remember is that if your product is an expensive product and there's a cheap generic, there's a reason why there's a difference in price. And that's got nothing to do with the herbicide in it. It's to do with everything else that's in there. So glyphosate's a really good example of this. All our cheap glyphosates, they have a surfactant in it that's made from palm oil. It's a pretty ordinary surfactant. Okay, it's not really all that good. All the expensive stuff has tallow-based surfactants, which are far better, but they cost a lot more. So you're not paying any extra for the glyphosate, you're paying for the surfactant. The same's true of things like clethodim. The more expensive clethodims, you're actually paying for the other things that are in there, things that are keeping clethodim in solution and so on. And what they do is they all help that herbicide perform. So it's about understanding your herbicides and when. Generics are just as good as everything else. So lots of times we would find, particularly a lot of our residual herbicides, because they're being taken up by the roots, it doesn't really matter what else you've got in there. Okay, so generics just as good, no difference. A lot of our grass herbicides, our FOP herbicides, no, it doesn't make much difference because they've all got a solvent in, and the solvent's just to keep the herbicide in solution, and so long as your solvent's good enough, they all work. But certain herbicides will turn around and go, actually, the generic ones don't perform as well. So if you come and do a degree at the University of Adelaide in agriculture, we actually demonstrate this in a practical. We show you that the generic formulations don't work as well, but also how to get them to work. But we've seen that with clethodim, we've seen it with propizamide, but that's a different issue. So propizamide is about how much work they do to mill the granules and get them small enough. Okay, so that costs money. So your more expensive products are better because they've got smaller granule sizes, and that allows that herbicide to, because it's not very water soluble, allows it to be taken up more easily because it dissolves faster out of the granule than a big granule. So I'm not saying don't use generics, but every so often, if you're recognising there's a bit of a difference, go for the expensive one. It will always or almost always work better. But the other tricks are timing, application, clethodim, adding an oil. Must add an oil to clethodim. Don't just put a sticker in.
So the issue of clethodim and cold temperatures not working as well, is there any way around that?
What can we do about cold temperatures not working very well? Well, we can wait for global warming. It'll fix that problem for us. We can spray them under warmer conditions if we can. But as one of the conversations I had with growers in South Australia about this is they're going, we're having a big series of frosts. When should I put our clethodim out? And I go, wait till you get a front come through. And you'll have a couple of days without frost, that's the time. And they go, well, what happens if that doesn't happen? And I go, well, at the timing that you need to put it out in canola, because we can only go to the 6th leaf stage, when your canola gets to the 6th leaf stage, you go out anyway. Even though you know it's not going to work as well. You just have to put it out. So there's only so much space we can move around those things. Butyroxydim doesn't have quite the same problem, which is why that, for us, that early clethodim plus butyroxydim, it's a little bit warmer. We got that mixture in there. We can make that work better. But we're going to be challenged by some of these things. And, cold conditions and clethodim is just one of the challenges that we have. And we just have to put up with it. We're not going to be able to fix that, not because you're not going to go out and heat your fields and things like that, because it's just not practical. We're kind of restricted to the chemistry we have, and I think one of the biggest problems small industries have is actually a lack of registrations, particularly for new stuff. So some of the stuff that's coming through in the grains industry takes a long, long time to filter down into these smaller industries. And it's a challenge we have because Australia's a small space. The companies, when they're bringing a new product, they don't think about you guys. They don't go, oh, this would be a great product for onions, we should bring it to Australia. They look at it and go, we can't make money off that. They go, we can kill ryegrass in wheat. That ticks all our boxes. Right, we're going to bring that in. If we can kill ryegrass in canola, that might get us there. But as the crops get smaller, then the return on their investment to bring a whole new product in is much smaller. What happens and is useful is if you can demonstrate that there's value in extending that registration to a crop like onions. And one of the things that I've learned over the years with thinking about how to do that with companies is that if you go and talk to them while they still have their patent on their molecule about getting an extended registration for something, they're much more willing to kick the dollars in and do it than if there are 20 generics out there. So one of the things I've spend my life being really proactive with is actually talking to the companies all the time about the chemistry they've got and how we can best use that chemistry. So I know that this is going to be a challenge for a small industry like you to do that, but if you've got the opportunity to have those conversations and go, look, we really need something for ryegrass control in onions. Have you got anything that you're bringing along that might do it? And I've done some work over the years, partnering with the companies where I've done actually some of the trial work. There's a number of registrations out there where trial work I've done's ended up in the registration package to convince them that we should move forward with this. So that's one of the things you can do is have those conversations. They might come to nothing. That's always a risk. But if you're not having those conversations, they don't think about you.
Where that market failure can be filled is with a project like All Innovation put up, which can do the work, you can generate the data that then the chemical companies can
That's right. So that's the other way of doing it, is to generate the data. But that's a really expensive process, because the really big costs are going to be around residue limits and environmental issues. They're the big costs. Just showing it work, that's cheap and easy. That's a cheap and easy bit. It's convincing them to do the other pieces of work. So, you know, in grains, we're looking at $500,000 for residue studies to get a label change. And so if somebody's got a generic, are they going to spend that money so everybody else can use it? Only if they partner with somebody. So somebody else has got to kick in some cash into that to make that work. But if they still own the molecule, it's a whole different conversation. So I'm thinking that, you know, this new project, rather than looking at all the really old stuff and saying, can we bring some of that really old stuff to onions? And we might be able to, is look at what's the really new stuff kicking around? Can we get some information about that and see if it's useful for us? And then go and have the conversation with the company and go, right, here's a set of data showing that this can be done in onions. What about, you know, what about thinking about us as an approach, as a different way of thinking about that? I know everybody always thinks about, we need the cheapest bit of chemistry, but that becomes challenging to get registrations for. And if you can't get permits, or if it's really hard to get permits, it becomes even more challenging. So we've done a bit of this through permits and got products in through permits, and they might have a couple of cycles of permits before the APVMA leans on the company and says, put it on your label. But if you can't go that route, then that's going to be a fairly significant challenge in terms of getting registration. So yes, we can show stuff works. Can we get it registered is a different question, and it's a question where you really need to be talking to the companies quite early in the piece about, you know, we think this will really suit onions. You know, we're doing some work on efficacy. And, you know, you want to have a conversation about that. Are you interested in perhaps expanding your label so that we could get it for onions? And sort of bring them along in the process rather than producing a whole bunch of data, dumping it on them and saying to them, okay, register this for us, and they'll look at it and go, well, we can't make any money out of it, why would we? So, you know, making sure you've got those conversations with the companies, you know what they're thinking. I've come up with some really great ways of using some bits of chemistry that have never come to label, mostly because I've had the conversation with the company and the company's gone, we don't want to do that. And they've had all sorts of reasons for that. Okay, so sometimes it's because they can't make money out of it. Sometimes because they see some of the things we do in Australia as being a risk to their brand overseas. It's really weird. I reckon farmers in Australia are some of the best users of herbicides in terms of how they use them and how they don't do damage to anything of anywhere in the world. Yet the companies see us as a risk to their brand elsewhere. So we have to deal with those perceptions as well. I can spend a lot of more time talking about that, but, you know, certainly, as I say, I've had experience around this. I've got some ideas about what I think really works. I'm happy to have those conversations with you later on about how we might go about some of this. But I will tell you, there's a suite of new bits of chemistry turning up.
Are they group A's, are they, Chris? Or?
No. Well, there is one group A. Okay. We've got one new group A turning up. Is it going to fix our problem? No, it's not. Okay, it's going to fix a piece of our problem. It might help you guys for a couple of years, but then you'll just end up with resistance to it. So we need to find things that aren't group A's. That's what we really need to be focusing on. But there's other bits of chemistry out there. I've got a trial this year with a new piece of chemistry in. I was going to have a second one, but the company pulled it at the last minute. But I've got 2 companies talking to me about products they want in my trials next year. Okay, so there are new products out there. It's a case of whether they're going to suit you guys. And there, I think the things you want to keep an eye on, keep looking at. You know, what's the new things that are coming? Will they work for us? Can we make them work for us?
What's the other piece of the puzzle, which is really important, what I noticed with the grain growers was they lose their mind when they find out how much per hectare it's going to cost them to use it. So it needs to happen really early on in the conversation as to how much the industry is going to wear at the user end, I suppose.
Yes, look, I mean, cost is an issue. But one of the things that my experience tells me that if it works, farmers are willing to pay for it. And that's the bit, it's got to work. So when when the development of Box of Gold back in the day started happening, Syngenta actually had a conversation with me about what I thought the price might be. And I said to them, here sitting in South Australia where we don't have trifluoride or any other pre-emergents working, we're using a thing we called the sledgehammer mix. And that was aptly named because it's what it did to your crop. And that was costing farmers $32 a hectare. And I said, you know, they're paying $32 a hectare for a product that damages their crop and doesn't really work. And Box of Gold came out at 38. They couldn't sell it in the West, so they brought it all the stuff from the West back to South Australia and sold every single drum. If it worked, farmers were going to pay for it. That practice I talked about that the agronomist was telling me he was getting his advisors in the southeast of South Australia to use, Overwatch followed by Matino Complete. Okay, that's over $100 worth of ryegrass pre-emergent chemistry he's using. These farmers are all doing it because they get an extra half a tonne to a tonne of wheat yield, and wheat's $300 a tonne. It pays. Plus they drive their numbers down and they get more money in their canola. So, you know, yes, we want to have it, it's inexpensive. We don't want to go out and tell the companies that, well, you know, farmers are going to pay $100 a hectare and it won't be a problem. We don't want to let them know that right up front because you know where the price will be. You know, the price of a new product comes out at what the companies think farmers will pay. It's not so much about the cost of it, because it's about the return on investment. Okay, they've invested 12 years and about $300 million to bring that product to you. They've got to get that money back. So they're going to charge what they think you'll pay for that. And what happened is that we demonstrated in the work that we were doing around pre-emergent herbicides that the value of pre-emergent herbicides for grain growers was not $12 a hectare, it was closer to $40. And the higher the rainfall you had, the more farmers were willing to pay. So Matino Complete came out for a pre-emergent herbicide you were going to use post-emergent, and you couldn't make it work that way. You had to have a pre-emergent up front as well. Bayer brought that out at $63 a hectare and sold it all, even at farmers who shouldn't have been using it. Okay, if it works, farmers will pay. So I think we need to broaden our horizon a little bit about, you know, let's focus on making sure it works rather than what's it going to cost. Because if we focus on what's it going to cost, we might get something that's cheap that doesn't work, which doesn't help us. So let's focus on it works and then argue the cost bit later. And there are other ways you can make that work in your rotation. I mean, you know, farmers say to me, how am I going to use this new expensive product? And I go, just put it in your worst paddock. Don't use it anywhere else. Just stick it in your worst paddock. See how it goes. So one paddock on the farm's costing them $50 a hectare and every other paddock's costing them $12. It's almost nothing. And, you know, and they move on from there. So there are ways to make more expensive products work in our system if we need to. But I think we need to focus on the problem, which is getting ryegrass control and not how much it's going to cost, because I'm sure onions are still pretty profitable as a crop. And if you can grow more onions, you can recoup those costs. And if you get to the point where you no longer have to use clethodim that doesn't work in crop, that's going to save you some money.
In the case of onions or carrots, the cost of failure is thousands of dollars a hectare. So
Yeah.
get it in context.
Yeah, I think that's the bit. So we want something that works rather than necessarily something that's cheap. Now, it'd be really nice if it was both. So I think that's that's how I think about it. And I get a lot of complaints from farmers. They say to me, "Everything you come up with, Chris, is really expensive." And I go, "Yeah, that's because you're using all the cheap things." And that's new stuff is going to cost more. That's just the nature of it.
The other option is that you have to remove that land from the cycle because you can't use it anymore for that particular crop.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is where we in the grains were faced with, is that there were crops we couldn't grow because we couldn't control ryegrass. So sometimes our most profitable crop we couldn't put in. And so when new products came, there were growers who were willing to say, I'm going to use that, even though it costs a lot, because it means I can grow my most profitable crop.
Has there been a cost-benefit analysis on that, the using cheap chemistry, but choice to not use expensive chemistry, and what their loss of opportunity cost is?
So we haven't really done that, but what we have done is we've run a long-term trial using that. And so we had this long-term trial, the other one I talked about, the one at Francis in South Australia, and got to the end of the trial, and our highest gross margin was in our most expensive weed control treatment. Okay, so big ryegrass numbers, it gets to be in your most expensive. We couldn't spend enough money on ryegrass control to stop farmers making more money. $145 a hectare we were spending on ryegrass control. And it was still making those guys money. Now, we wouldn't do that in the Mallee where they're only growing, 2 tonne of wheat, because it wouldn't work. We can't make it happen. But where you've got high yield potential, and ryegrass robs you of a lot of yield potential. Not through any competitiveness of a single ryegrass plant, but the sheer number that are out there. So if you get really big numbers, you end up not harvesting anything. So in those high yielding environments, you can actually spend a lot more, afford to spend a lot more for ryegrass control and still make money. So that's the evidence that we have around this. Of course, when things come off patent and they become cheaper and they're still working, well, that's just a bonus. That means you can afford to use them more often. You're going to make more money because they're cheaper. So they're eventually it'll come back. But in that early phase of new chemistry, it's going to be expensive. You can sit on your hands and wait, but as I told you, if you sit on your hands and wait for everything to come off patent and then talk to the companies about getting a registration, it's going to be a lot more challenging, because they're going to look at it and go, onions? How much money can we make in onions? Whereas if they still have the patent, they know they can make some more money. They've got some protection before everybody else comes in and sells cheap stuff. So part of it's about making the whole system work, making it so that the companies are still there to be able to provide products for you, because they have to make money to do so. If they don't make any money, they go broke and we don't have them.
Yeah, so the later in that patent cycle they are when you approach them, or when they actually get the label registration, means you have to pay more per hectare so that it's all paid back before it goes.
No, not necessarily, because the thing I said about this, and you can say I'm being really cynical, but the companies look at how much will a grower actually pay to use this product, and they go and do their sums. They don't just talk to me about it. They go and do their sums, and they look what growers are currently doing, and they go, this product is X amount better than what growers are currently doing, so they'll pay more for it. And they'll work it out that way. So, Boxer Gold came out at $38 a hectare. When Sakura came out, it came out at 40. Boxer Gold went back to 36 because it wasn't as good. And so to be more competitive, they dropped the price. Overwatch came out at 42 because they reckon it was going to be better. Mateno Complete at 63 because it was in a space where the only other product in that space didn't really work very well. And they went, well, actually, we talked to growers, and growers said, yeah, we'll pay for something like this. So they put the price right up, and growers paid for it. Even ones who didn't need to paid for it. So, you know, I think that the cost of the product is about what they expect growers will pay. And one of the things that we see about that is that where we've got products for horticulture and products for grains, they're often a bit more expensive in horticulture because horticulture is more profitable. Okay, that's how it all works. So the space in the cycle doesn't really matter so much because if they're early in the cycle and they can charge a lot for it, it just means they make more profit, which is good. But they've got to make some profit. And they'll be looking at, yep, this is our, and if they don't think they can make any profit, we won't see it. Okay, I've played with bits of chemistry that haven't actually come because the company looked at what it was competing with and said, we don't think we can get any farmers to buy our chemistry for enough money to make it profitable, therefore we're not bringing it. Okay, they're hard-headed business decisions, what the companies are up to. And I think our opportunity to influence the companies is to influence them about the things we really care about. And I've spent 20 years trying to do this, to influence them about the things that we really care about, making sure that we get products that really work for us, rather than just getting stuff that's kind of okay.
No one has any more burning questions?
Oh yeah, I'll finish up on my time. I spent all the talking about how to get herbicides registered.
No, you've got time. I just thought you might like to get through.
All right.
I just quickly got one for you.
Yeah.
About clethodim rates.
Yes.
So, we see a lot of people upping clethodim rates thinking they're going to control resistant ryegrass with increasing the rate of clethodim. And we see off-label usage of clethodim rates a lot now. And people went to 500 mil, I went to 500 mils in canola years ago because I saw it was a possibility. Not for that target weed, but that's what I did. What I found is, I don't know what you found, is where is the sensitivity level of clethodim where it doesn't matter what rate you get to, you're not going to solve the problem?
All right, I'm going to tell you about some secret research I did that we never actually gave to farmers because the result was sending the wrong message. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about that. So we did these trials on canola because we know clethodim causes damage to canola and will reduce yield. But we went out in a reasonably sized ryegrass population and we kept using increasing rates. We went up to 2 litres of clethodim. The most profitable treatment in that whole lot was 2 litres of clethodim, even though we got crop damage, because it did better ryegrass control. So, you know, one thing's about clethodim, you can keep upping it, but it becomes unsustainable after a while because once they're resistant to 2 litres, they're not susceptible to 3. So, you know, that's where we sit with that. So I go, look, no, just stay on label because then you don't get residue problems. Not that we've had any residue problems with clethodim, but you don't get residue problems, you don't do crop damage. And if you don't have a lot of ryegrass, yes, going to 2 litres is going to damage your crop more than the benefit you get out of the ryegrass. So that's a secret research that we never told farmers about because it sent the wrong message, which is saying you can go up to 2 litres. Don't. It's really, the value of going to 2 litres is so low unless you've got a big ryegrass population that it's not really worth it. So, you know, stay on label. Far better to mix butroxin in with it. That's actually turned out to be a much better strategy than lifting your clethodim rates.
Are you seeing any damage to crops from butroxidin?
Yes, canola gets damaged by butroxidin, which is, it's registered for canola, but in my trials we never use it in canola because we get too much damage.
What's the damage look like?
So the worst damage is, so you get some damage to the plant, but the worst damage is actually to the flowers. So the flowers don't open, and if they don't open, they don't pollinate, and you don't get seed. So we get a lot more damage from butroxidin in canola. Pulses are really tolerant. Pasture, clover seed, really tolerant of butroxidin. It's just all their ryegrass is resistant to it. So we don't use it in canola, but we use it in all our other crops where it's registered. even though it's got a registration for canola, but it's just when you're mixing it with clethodim at high rates, because clethodim is also canola sensitive too, you give it a double whammy, and that's a real problem. Even early on, you'll set the crop back with butroxytim. So it's a decision we've made about how we think about that bit of chemistry. So the companies that sell it say, no, it's perfectly safe. And it is if you're just using it on its own. But as soon as you start mixing it with other bits of chemistry, that all changes, because the other bits of chemistry are causing a little bit of damage too. And the worst thing to do is to have two herbicides out there that are both damaging your crop, because then instead of getting a little bit of damage, you end up with a lot. So we just prefer to keep that out of canola and use it in the pulse phase, where the pulses are just so tolerant it doesn't matter. We don't get any damage. Yeah.
Yep. Now you're going with APVMA now, and in the endeavour to bring in new products from overseas, can they utilise research that's already done overseas, or do we have to reinvent it here in Australia?
All right, so the answer is, registering a product, can they use overseas research? Yes, they can. However, there are certain bits they need to supplement with research from Australia. So you must have efficacy data from Australia, and you must have some environmental data from Australia, but you don't need to do toxicology.
We do have a webinar on the VegNET website from Peter Del Santo, and he talks about everything that's required to access minor use permits.
So do we need to do some more political lobbying to try and tidy them up a bit?
It's quite a good process. We can share the link to the webinar with you later.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm
They'll all be starving, Chris.
okay. Well, I thought I was answering all the questions. Okay, well, I've got to give you the really short version of this so that you can all get lunch. So, factors that are important in pre-emergent herbicide are the behaviour of the herbicide, what your soil type is, and this includes both texture and organic matter. Rainfall, when you get your rainfall. Now, you guys got irrigation so that you can do things differently. Tillage, how much tillage you're doing, or if you're not doing any tillage, what your seeding system is. And a thing I like to call inherent crop safety. So what happens if that herbicide actually gets to where your crop is? Okay, so they're the things that I really worry about when I'm thinking about how do we get pre-emergent herbicides to work. So one of the first things I think about is about tillage, and this is something I showed a grain grower, so you're getting the grain grower version of this. But if we're doing some tillage prior to sowing our crop, what we do is we mix all that ryegrass seed through the depth of tillage. So if you're doing that tillage shallow, you're only going to mix it this far. But yeah, if you're doing it really deep because you're building hills or something like that, you're going to mix that ryegrass right through there. That's a real challenge for pre-emergent herbicides, because the vast majority of pre-emergent herbicides we have need to be taken up by the roots of the germinating seedling or right at the seed level. So you've got to get it down there. If we have a really low disturbance system, so as you move into the cereal phase, if you've got a really low disturbance system where you're leaving all those weeds on the surface, it's so much easier to get your pre-emergent herbicide there. And it's one of the reasons why in the grains industry in Australia, we make pre-emergent herbicides work so well, better than any other country in the world, because we have this low disturbance system we're running, where we're leaving all of those ryegrass seeds on the surface. So understanding what you're doing then dictates the sorts of bits of chemistry you're going to want to try and choose to use. I'm going to skip over soil type because the only thing about soil type is light soils get a lot more movement than heavier soils. So there are things you can do in light soils that you wouldn't try in heavy soils, and there are some things you can do in heavy soils that you'd never try in light soils. But this is the crucial bit that drives their behaviour. There are two things: solubility, and solubility is probably the number one. Okay, that's the most important thing that you need to be thinking about. how soluble is my herbicide and where's it going to go. And then there's this other bit over here, which is actually binding to soil components. Mostly that's organic matter, but for some herbicides they bind to other things as well. And the importance of that is if that's low, it means the herbicide has got a high leaching potential. Okay, because it's not going to bind to anything on the way down. You keep adding water, it's just going to zip down through the soil. If it's really high, as in stomp, it means your herbicide's not going anywhere. Okay, it's going to stay close to the surface. So you have to worry about both of those things. So products that have really high solubility and really low binding are the ones that disappear out the bottom of the profile. Once they start getting more binding, once they start getting to that medium stage, they're going to move more slowly because every time they meet a bit of organic matter, they're going to go and sit on the organic matter until you add more water, and then they're going to hop off the organic matter back into the water until they meet another bit of organic matter and go back on that, and that just slows them down. So with all of this sort of chemistry, as I said, most of it we need to get to the weed seed. So that changes how we think about how we might need to use some of this chemistry. So we're going to use these ones down here in a system where we've got a lot of tillage and we've mixed that ryegrass seed well with the soil. We're going to need quite a lot of moisture, either rainfall or irrigation, to drive them down to where the weed seeds are. Okay, and so often we'll find in those sorts of systems that if we don't get that moisture, don't get that rainfall, they cannot work very well. Now, the exceptions to all of that rules are this herbicide here, trilate, because trilate is the only one of those that's absorbed by the cotyledon of the grasses that comes through the surface of the ones I've listed there. So it needs to be closer to the surface. And it's got all of the properties to keep it close to the surface. It's got a low solubility and it binds tightly to organic matter. So it's really good for staying close to the surface. It used to be a wild oat herbicide because wild oats tended to be deep and it was really effective. We've turned it into a ryegrass herbicide and it's a poor wild oat herbicide now because we're leaving all our wild oats on the surface in the grains industry. But we're mixing the soil. That's a herbicide with potential. And the other one, it's this one down here, pendimethalin. So this trifluralin, aryzalin, those three bits of chemistry, they work quite differently because all of the others need to be dissolved in soil water to be taken up. Those three turn into a gas on contact with water and are taken up as a gas. So where they go is less important. So they don't need to be moved down through the profile. That gas just needs to be in the soil when the seedling germinates. So those ones behave a little bit differently. It means we can do different things with them. But for the rest, we're thinking about how soluble it is, how far do I want it to go, what happens if it goes too far. So Tenet here, metazoclor, we had that as a pre-emergent herbicide. We completely gave up using it as a pre-emergent herbicide because whenever it rained, it went too far and it killed the crop and didn't kill the ryegrass. And so it became problematic. So we're using it as a post-emergent herbicide, as a residual post-emergent herbicide, where it doesn't matter if it goes down a bit further because our crop is now established. So we can change how we use some of this chemistry based on its the nature. One of the things we did years ago was look at the potential, because we're worried in our system where we've got this knife point press wheel system and you throw the herbicide out of the furrow and onto the interrow, so you've got no herbicide in the furrow, great for crop safety, terrible for controlling weeds. And we didn't have ryegrass in the furrow or on the shoulder. So we looked at the potential for early post-emergent applications of pre-emergent herbicides to pick that ryegrass up. And initially we focused on box of gold because it's got a really soluble component. And so we, with Syngenta, developed box of gold for that. And then Bayer came round with Matino Complete for the same purpose, but they use that differently. You don't actually pick up the ryegrass that's already germinated, which is why you've got to have a pre-emergent herbicide up front. You're only picking up the stuff that's going to germinate from then on. So if you read their label, they actually tell you to put it out when you don't have any ryegrass. I don't say go out and wait till the ryegrass is 2 to 3 leaf stage and go and put it out. They go, no, it's best to put it out early, before the ryegrass has germinated, because it's not as water soluble. And if you don't get rain on it, it doesn't work, because it doesn't wash down to where it's got to go. So thinking about those things, you can actually start thinking about, well, what are the best bits of chemistry that are going to suit any particular system, based on where it's got to go to get to those weed seeds, and how is it going to work. And one of the things that I'm not going to show you, but we've done around this, is that we recognise that every single one product we have has got weaknesses due to not enough rainfall, too much rainfall, ryegrass seeds too deep, ryegrass seeds too shallow, it's in the wrong place, and we use a lot of mixtures to deal with that. So we mix 2 pre-emergent herbicides together with different characteristics. One of our favourites was using Sakura with Avidex. Okay, Avidex taken up by the coleoptile, so it's sitting on the surface, so it didn't matter if it didn't rain, the Avidex got the weeds, but if it rained, the Sakura got the weeds. Worked really well. So thinking about, can we actually use a mixture to deal with the weeds that might escape our pre-emergent herbicide because they're not going where they should go? Yeah.
I haven't used Avidex Extra because I don't know how safe it's going to be. We put everything on post-sowing pre-emergent generally, including Sakura. We don't see too much drama. Would you see a drama with Avidex?
Okay, so it depends what crop you're going to put it on. So we would use Avidex on wheat, and it's perfectly safe on wheat. Okay?
Post-sowing pre-emergent.
Post-sowing pre-emergent, yeah. The only thing about post-sowing pre-emergent with Avidex is that it does have some slight volatility, so you might tend to lose some if you don't get rainfall shortly afterwards. But where people have done this post-sow pre-emergent applications, they typically, well, if they're doing with the Sakura, they're typically in spaces where they can get moisture. It either rains all the time, or they've got the possibility of irrigation. So you can always fix that problem with irrigation, if need be, or if it doesn't work 100%, it'll give you something.
Which ones aren't safe in that?
Okay, things that aren't completely safe on wheat. I've got most of them not in here. Well, we know dimethenamide P is not particularly safe on wheat because we did a whole bunch of trials with that and showed that it wasn't ever going to make wheat. Carbetamide's not safe on wheat. Metazoclor's not safe on wheat. But of the wheat products, the ones we really worry, so they're not wheat products. The wheat products are the ones we really worry about, Luxamax. And my attitude in South Australia is we don't use Luxamax because we just never get the environmental conditions to make it safe. BASF are still grumpy at me, but that's reality.
What conditions are those? What conditions are those?
Well, what it needs to have a full profile of moisture and then no rainfall for several weeks afterwards. Really challenging. I mean, we've had 2 of the driest starts on record in South Australia, and most guys have sown dry, so no, it's not going to make it for that.
Both in the UK, Luxamax is registered post-sowing pre-emergent. Or even early post-emergent.
No, they tell you not to use it that way.
Yeah, right.
Luxamax, look, frankly, Luxamax on wheat, I'm really struggling to find ways to use that anywhere in Australia. The environmental conditions are always not quite right. I know BASF are looking for a registration in another crop, and if that comes and it's safe, I will be really happy because I'll be able to say we can use this herbicide that we want to use because it's a completely different mode of action to everything else we're using and we don't have resistance to it. We'll be able to use it in our rotation, but we're not using it on wheat. That's my attitude in South Australia, and I've got just about every agro in South Australia completely agrees with me. We're not using it on wheat because of our experience with it.
Reached on canola?
Not yet. Not yet. The other one that we can have some issues with is overwatch. Generally safe on wheat, but under the wrong conditions you can do a lot of damage, and I had some, saw some crops last year that had some bare patches in them where overwatch had actually killed the crop.
It's very persistent too.
It is really persistent, and its challenge is for rotations as well. It's not the only one that's persistent. I'll show you persistence in a minute. Okay.
What happened with the overwatch?
Which speed?
The crop.
Okay, so the conditions that we had was where you dry sowing with it, and where you either didn't get your crop deep enough or you moved treated soil on top of the crop.
Don't follow potato paddock.
And look, the big issues are around rotational aspects of it too. There are some species that are really, really susceptible, and it's a real challenge. Going to be a real challenge, I think, for you guys to fit it in your rotation, because you need to have a tolerant crop afterwards.
Well, spuds are most often followed by wheat here as well.
Yeah.
I've stopped using it post potatoes because paddocks too fluffy.
Mm.
But if it's direct drilled, it works beautifully. It
Yeah.
works really well.
So the other place where we've had a lot of damage is where people have put it out after soil amelioration, which is exactly the same as growing potatoes. Okay, so you're doing a really deep working of the soil, and it just opens up the pores too much, and there's too much movement. Yeah, because even though it's not that soluble, it doesn't really bind that tightly. So it binds about the same as Sakura, but Sakura's got 1/10 the solubility. So that's how you think about it. All right, going to skip that because I've already talked about that. Okay, persistence. This is another thing that we have to worry ourselves with. Might just go back one. I think I've gone one too many. Yeah. So the way we measure persistence is how long the herbicide lasts in the soil, and it's a thing they call the half-life over number of days. So how much gets broken down. So you've got these herbicides up the top that break down really quickly, and generally speaking, the ones in that low pattern, you would go, probably won't get residual effects out of those. They won't be carryover effects, but you need to be careful because some of them are really effective at low rates on some crops. So we have carryover effects from Sakura. Even though it's got a short half-life, we still get carryover effects. The ones down the bottom here are ones where you can be pretty sure that you'll get some carryover effect if you're growing a susceptible crop the next year. So those are ones that are more likely to affect your crop rotation.
What is Avidex effect? What could affect Avidex?
Well, mostly we don't see it with Avidex. So the rules, we use this number to help us think about it, but in practice we find that some of them don't. And I think because Avidex is, even though it's got moderate persistent, once it gets to the surface, we lose some as a gas into the atmosphere, and eventually that drives us, and it's only near the surface, and we're so deeper than that, we just don't see the issue because you're moving soil out of your crop row. So we rarely see plant back effects from Avidex, even though it should do it. But as I say, by the same token, Sakura shouldn't, but we see plant back effects. So don't look at that number and just go, oh yeah. It's an indication of where you might sit because of this reason. So if we think about a herbicide's breaking down, and if we've got this amount of herbicide is what we need to have to be safe in the crop, okay? If we got a herbicide that's got quite a slow breakdown, if we start off with only a little bit, that'll become safe quite quickly. But if we start off with a lot more, it's going to take a lot longer for it to become safe. But if we got another herbicide that breaks down really quickly, but we start off with a lot more than our subsequent crop can tolerate, we might still have residues there. even though it's being broken down quite quickly. And that's our Sakura problem. We're putting out far more than we could ever safely use in canola, so there's still some there, and oats it's even worse. There's still quite a lot there if we're going into oats. So don't just think about those numbers, think about what's the safety of the crop I'm sowing. So the labels are your guide here, and the plant backs on the labels are something to really focus on and go, if it says 36 months to sowing canola or whatever crop it might be, it's probably a good reason that's on there. Okay, the companies don't squeeze themselves out of markets just for fun. Okay, what they want is they want no complaints. They don't want anybody complaining to them because that costs them money. And so they will have these on there because they've seen damage and damage has occurred. And sometimes we'll see things that they didn't actually know about because they did all the work, but then we get environmental conditions that are different. And suddenly they'll go back and they'll redo some of that plant back. So occasionally we'll see those plant backs change. So check the label, even if you've been using it for 20 years. Always check the label about plant backs just to make sure nothing's changed around them. Okay.
Just one other point on that, the difference, I think you mentioned the UK before, one of the challenges is the formulations of products can be quite different even under the same name. You know, Reflex here versus Reflex in the US is actually a different formulation. So the plant back guidance on some of the international labels may not necessarily reflect plant back that you would expect for the local formulation.
I think that's a really good point. One of the things I should discourage people from doing is reading overseas labels and then going, oh, if it's used in Canada, we can use it here, or if it's used in England, we can use it here, because the conditions are actually quite different. And we can end up with situations where, you know, you get a really bad result out of it. One example I can talk about from my own experience, we did a lot of work with coated betamite in canola in Australia, looking to get a registration for it because it's registered in Canada. We're not ever going to get a registration for it in Australia because of residue limits. It turns out the canola in Australia, under the growing conditions we grow it, takes that herbicide up more than it does in Canada. So just little things like that can just completely change how that product can be used in different environments. One of the reasons why they do need to have data from Australia. I'm just thinking, going to skip a couple of things. This is on this mixture bit. So this is some work we did. 4 herbicides. This is 6 trials. 4 herbicides on their own. This is the sort of result we got. It didn't matter which herbicide we had. Worked really well in one trial. Be rubbish in a different trial. All about the environment. And for trifluralin and trifluralin resistant weeds. We start using mixtures here with Avadex Extra. They all improved. And then we went to these pre plus post. So putting a herbicide out in front and coming back with another one later, pre-emergent later. So the sort of thing that was being talked about in onions that Peter Batsalis was thinking about. Started doing that and we could tighten some of those up again. So mixtures can be part of the solution to the problem of your chemistry not working. Oh, by the way, what were we measuring? Reduction in ryegrass seed heads. So we were looking at what happened over the whole season, not how many weeds we killed, but how much of the seed we reduced, okay? And this one up here was between 95 and 100% in those trials. And consistent. And that's why when this product came out, the farmers on the Eyre Peninsula who'd seen one of these trials, they didn't just use Sakura on its own, they went straight to Sakura plus Avadex. And it's why now we're using these other practices, because they looked at that and said, nah, this is what we want. All right, I've got one more thing I'm going to show you. This document. Soil behaviour of pre-emergent herbicides from the GRDC website. It is a really good manual if you want to know more about how this chemistry works and all the things I don't have time to talk about. You know, that's available from the GRDC website. They've got one on post-emergent herbicides as well if you want to get into post-emergent herbicides. But this covers all of the key aspects, all the things I've talked about, gives a lot more detail. The key things to think about for all of the herbicides you might want to use. So, you know, really valuable tool to get better understanding about what's going on. So I can see lunch is coming out.
We've got another thing that we want to get through for about...
And so I'm going to stop right there so you can get through your other thing.
But I know we've got time for a couple of questions. But only a couple.
So when you're talking about Avedex, that's going on in, like with Secura as well, and that just goes on, because obviously we're doing it after we've planted. Is that still, like putting the Secura out, is that still safe to do, like to get the extra control with the Avedex?
Oh yeah, in wheat, yeah. I mean, I know people who do it that way.
Yeah.
I mean, for security, you've got to make sure that you've got some rainfall or irrigation to drive it down.
Yeah, that's fine.
And that's, you know, for you guys, that's fine. And the people who do this are in situations where they can achieve that. But it seems it's safe. I mean, Avedex is really safe on wheat.
Yeah, right. And it has got good control on the resistant ryegrass.
Well, we have some Avedex resistant ryegrass, none known from Tasmania though. Most of it's known from areas that have been using a lot of Avedex for other reasons, or were early adopters of Box of Gold, because prosulfocarp's the same chemical group.
Yeah, because I see on the label it's also can be used for poppies.
Yes.
And I don't think I've ever seen a rec for poppies for Avedex and high-resistant ryegrass paddocks, so you did it once. You did?
I've done it a couple of times.
One of the things that I will recommend about Avedex, yeah, exactly. Using Avedex on its own is not the best way to use that molecule. It makes a really, really good mixing partner with something else. And it can take other bits of ordinary chemistry and turn them into really quite effective a herbicide mixture. But on its own, it just has too many weaknesses.
Any other burning questions? Chris will be around for a little bit after lunch too.